Hello, this is Jose Luis here at Parametric Camp, and welcome to another video in this series, Advanced Development in Grasshopper. Continuing with the topic of version control, in this video I would like to teach you techniques on how to properly and how to follow best practices on extending, improving, and creating new and better versions of your code. Because it turns out that when you improve your code, it's a good practice to keep older versions available for people who have old files, etc., etc. And Grasshopper has very nice way of doing that. So what I would like to teach you in this video is how to create, for example, a new version of the plugin version component that we created in the previous video, one that creates outputs also major, minor, and patch versions individually, and how to make sure that both versions are available in your plugin so that you can keep up or you can allow legacy components to also run and create new versions of the component, but also at the same time, how to hide those old versions of the component that you don't want people to use anymore. So that from that moment on, only the most updated, more modern version is available for you. This is very good practice for the reasons that I'm going to explain in the previous video. This technique is called how to handle deprecations and how to handle obsolete code when you update and when you move on to better versions of your code. So let's get hands-on with that, and let me start by describing the problem a bit more in detail. So first of all, why are we doing this? So you may have downloaded Grasshopper definitions from the internet, from old forums, or maybe you have opened old Grasshopper definitions of your previous lives. And you have noticed that when you open old code, very often you get components that have this kind of old tag on top of them. And actually, for example, this component, grid rectangular, if I try to find it in my component box, doesn't exist anymore. So the idea is that when you develop code and when you look at the future of that code, some good practices about code being good and working across time is that when you make changes in a particular code base, you want to make sure that those changes are going to be changes that do not break previous code. So imagine if I were to open an old definition and it turns out that the code that was inside of these components had changed over the course of time and development, then maybe the behavior of this definition would actually change and it would not work as it used to work 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So it's good practice that when you make such changes, you do it in a way that you don't break code that already exists and the people that are out there that the people out there are using. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that you also want to make sure that if you make changes, you still provide access to old versions of the code in the previous state that it was. Again, because you don't want people who had those older versions to just not have that code. If the developers had removed this component that is not available anymore, I can use it, I cannot click it, but if they had totally removed it from the Grasshopper code base, if I were to open this old definition with a modern Grasshopper, this component would not be available, it wouldn't show, and the whole thing would break, and my old definition would not be usable. So providing ways to access old code in the way it was written back then, even if that code is not available anymore or if it has been updated, it's actually a very, very good practice. So what I'd like to teach you in this video is how to make those two things. First of all, how to make changes on code that already exists, and make sure that those changes are going to be backwards compatible, so the people who have old versions of the code still have access to those versions. And I would also like to teach you how to prevent people from using old versions that exist and that are hidden somewhere in your code base, but prevent them from using the old versions and make sure that moving on after you make changes, they only have access to the newer versions. So let's take a look then at how can we make this happen when we write our Grasshopper plugin. As an example, we're going to start with our almighty component that we did in the previous video in this series, the one that gives us the semantic version of the current plugin that we're working with. And the way we implemented it in the past was by just outputting a string with the three values of the major, the minor, and the patch versions. But it could arguably be interesting. I mean, this is very easy to split and to parse into integers, whatever, but it takes a little bit of time and work. So I guess it would be interesting to have the component directly output as numbers also the major, the minor, and the patch version, right? So that could be something, for example, I'm going to close this, and that could be something. Here is where we had the information in this public static class that we made. And this is the component that spits out just the text version of all of that together, and that is drawn from the static class. So if I were to overwrite this with a version that had an output for the major, the minor, the patch, and then it outputs those three values as integers, this would be a very nice improvement to that component. However, if we just do this, if we just basically change the code right away, and especially, this is also a big one, in Grasshopper, if we change the component structurally, so if we add or remove more inputs, if we add or remove outputs, then something not good stuff is going to happen. So let me show you. If I now open the same file, the file that had a version component but expected the output to be just one thing, look at what's going to happen. I am getting already IO generated these 5 messages that are errors, and this is telling me that the archive is corrupt. This is because the file that it read expected one output, and now it's finding that the component actually yields 4 outputs. I can still execute the file, so you see it still works, and it gives me the major, minor, and the patch, so it kind of works, but I get errors. It's just not clean. So what we're going to do is we're going to scratch that, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a new version of the version component, and then we're going to follow the right paths to manage that. So what is that going to look like? Well, first of all, I'm going to bring everything to the original state. So I'm going to keep the original version of this component. And remember, something that is very important is that Grasshopper knows which component is which, if you remember, because of the global unique identifier, right? This is basically the ID, or like the signature or the DNA of the component, if you will. And whenever a Grasshopper sees a component with this name, it expects the exact same behavior. So what we will need to do is basically make a new version of this component that has the extended functionality by maintaining this current version. So what is that going to look like? First of all, where is this? Plugin version component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and I'm going to paste this component. So now I have 2 versions. And the copy version, I'm going to call it plugin version 2. All right, for example. So this is going to be the new version. It has a different class name, so now they both can live on the same project. And I'm going to rename the file as well, so to make sure that we now know. And I'm going to call this. I'm going to change the description also here, but just for reasons that you will see here, I would not do this otherwise. Okay. Now, the last thing that I want to do is this. If I run this code, this is not going to work. I think it doesn't work. It's not going to work because since I copy pasted, I do now have 2 components, 2 possible components that have the exact same global unique identifier. You see, component ID conflict. And this is a terrible thing. No 2 components in your plugin can have the same ID. So we need to change that. And for example, one thing that I typically use is that I have this. I think there's a way to do that in C# inside, but I think I have here online UII. Yeah, so here I have this website that I typically use to generate random GUIDs. So I'm going to copy this one. I'm going to replace the one that we got from the copy pasting. And now you can see that, well, sorry, let me close this again. So I'm going to stop all of this. And now the version, the extended version, the one that is newer, I would like to add all this code. So the version, the major, minor, etc., etc. All right. And then, so now what I can do is I can say, oops, something went wrong. What is wrong here? Version 2 component, then I implement register inputs. Oh, sorry. I think I copy pasted where I shouldn't. So I'm going to, yeah, register inputs. Sorry, I copy pasted where I shouldn't. So now, all right. So now I have the two versions of my component. I have the old one, which still works because I haven't changed it. I only added a new one. And then if I go to info, you can see that I have two ones that are that have the exact same name. So I have the old one here, but I have, can you see the improved in the description? I have the improved one, which gives me the 4 outputs. And you can see that nothing broke, everything is working well, etc., etc. So this is the way to go when you make changes or improvements. What you should actually do, and I know it takes a lot of work, what you should actually do is you should actually copy and paste your component, give it a new name, and then make all the changes that you want, keeping the old one in the code base. All right. So, but now I have two problems here. First, we want this deprecation. We want that sticker, the old sticker, to show up here. That's one thing that we want. And another thing that we want is I probably don't want to give people the option of going for the old version or the new version. I want to get rid of the old one as well, right? So I'm going to keep this here. So now you can see that in my Grasshopper definition, I have both. I have the old and I have the new. So I'm going to save this file as it is, all right? And then I'm going to do a couple things. First, I want the tag, I want the sticker to show up for the component that is not, that I don't want anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the older one, and here in the name, I'm going to right click, I'm going to go to rename, all right? And then I'm going to add to the name of the class, and this is a very Grasshopper thing, this is not a C# thing. I'm going to add here an underscore, and I'm going to write the word obsolete in uppercase, all right? And I'm going to change that. You see that the file name changes, the class name changes, the constructor name changes. And just by doing that, Grasshopper is actually able to recognize this tag from the class name, and it's going to be able to assign this old obsolete tag to basically any component that has that name. So you can see that I open my same file and I already get this tag here. And so that's great, but you can see that I also get it here on the icons, and that I still have the two versions. I still have the two versions available to drag. So I can still drag the old one. I can still create the old one, which is probably something that we don't want to give as a possibility. So how do we do that? Well, if you remember from previous videos, there was this property that we could override in Grasshopper components, which was the exposure. So if I go all the way down here, you can say public override, and you can see that I should have exposure somewhere. Exposure, yes. So exposure is basically a way to say where the component is going to show up in the order of the components of the in the category. So, and actually, the way to control this is you have primary, secondary, ternary, etc., correct? And what that means is that there's this nice division by that you can see in the category. I'm going to show that, all right? But what you want to do, instead of having primary, secondary, or whatever, I think primary is the default for all of them. What you want to do is you want to make this component hidden. By making the exposure hidden, what you're basically saying is that it's not going to show up on the drop-down in the categories, and therefore it's going to basically disappear from a click and drag kind of option. So if I now run this code, you can see two things. First, I still do have the component with my old tag here, but if I go to my breakdown, you can see that it's not available anymore. The only one that shows up available is the plugin version that is improved, and you can see that in the description. The only one that I have the option to drag and drop is the new version. People, if they have all definitions, they will still have access to the old one, and it will work correctly because it's drawing the information from the static class, etc., etc. But they won't have the option to use the old one ever again. They just cannot drop it into a definition ever again. Actually, that is not entirely true because thanks to Victor, a parametric camper, he was pointing out while we were recording this video that there's actually this trick where you can actually access all deprecated hidden components. If you double click on the canvas and you start with a pound sign, this will give you access to components that have been deprecated or that do not exist anymore. So for example, plugin version, where do I have that plug? You see, here I can use plugin version or I can choose the old one. You know, this is very nerdy and hacky, but I don't think this is very useful because in general, I really think you should always stick to the most modern and the most debugged functional version of any component. Okay, just a hacky thing. So that's it. These are the two things that you need to make sure to remember every time you want to extend, improve, or work on a new version of a component that already exists. Make sure to, first of all, not change the existing code, but create a new component with the same name and most of the things the same. Change the ID so there are no conflicts, and then work your changes into the new component that you have created. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that for the old component, you want to make sure that first of all that you rename the class to add the obsolete suffix so that you get the tag. And you also want to make sure that you change the exposure to hidden so that it doesn't show up on the dropdown and people cannot add it anymore. Those are just the simple things to do here. And another thing that some people do, I've seen that, well, I'm seeing it. I actually do it myself. Because this can get complicated over time when you start deprecating and making a lot of things obsolete. Something that I have done in the past and I've seen other people do is sometimes what you just want to do is you want to take all the components that you don't use anymore and put them somewhere. So for example, I'm going to create a folder that is called obsolete, and I'm just going to move this one, the one that doesn't exist. I'm just going to move it into obsolete. And the way Grasshopper projects work actually will, because all the components are generated and created, it doesn't matter where they are in the folders, everything will still work the same. So it's a nice way to basically keep the structure of your Grasshopper plugin project clean in a way, if you will. It's like having a folder that is kind of the obsolete folder or the cemetery or the graveyard or however you want to call it. Components that are not in use anymore, but they should be available and the code should be accessible for backwards compatibility. Okay? Unless you release a major version where you make breaking changes and anything that was obsolete and old, you get rid of it. Okay, that's also an approach. That's why we have major versions. Beautiful. With that, I think that's all I wanted to cover about deprecation and obsolete components during development. If you thought any of this was useful or you liked it or you learned anything, maybe consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, etc., etc. Otherwise, I will see you on the next video, which I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I'm sure it's going to be something fun and exciting and nerdy. Thank you very much, and see you in the next one. Bye.